Most adolescents choose to attempt suicide in their homes after 3 o'clock, usually when no one's home. Completed suicides, as it shows, were after 3. And across all ages. I just found this sort of an interesting, kind of quirky piece of information, so I included it. All ages of suicide occur on Monday. That's the day people choose to attempt suicide. I'm not sure the meaning of that. I don't think anybody really understands the meaning of that either. But it's important to know and to alert parents and to talk to adolescents about suicide plans. It's important to understand that it's usually done at home and it's done alone. So, what methods are usually used? They're primarily influenced by accessibility and readiness for use. So if you grow up in a culture, maybe your family are hunters, or you grow up in the South where guns are readily available, or if you grow up in an urban setting where guns are available, it's more than likely that you will use a firearm because it has to do with accessibility. And that's one, we'll discuss how it's important to know about what sorts of methods are available for adolescents when you're working with them. Knowledge, experience, and familiarity is another important thing that contributes to the choice of a method for suicide attempts and suicide completions. And the other thing that's important is the meaning and symbolism and cultural significance of the choice of method. For instance, when we think about symbolism, taking pills can symbolize wanting to go to sleep, a peaceful, gradual death. And a peaceful sleep is sort of a symbolic equivalent of death, and in that we can see the denial of death and the wish to have peace. I once worked with an adolescent who had an active plan to climb up on her roof. She had a window, and there was a tree, and then it had another way that she could get back up on the roof, and she had actively planned to get on the roof and leap and fly. And as we began to talk about this, she talked about the death of her pet bird that she had gotten years earlier and had taken care of. And when the bird died, she thought that that was a very peaceful way to die. And so she thought that she would get on the roof and fly away to heaven. This was also an adolescent who felt trapped by a very difficult situation at home. She was the witness to very violent domestic abuse and felt trapped and unable to deal with it. So flying away was symbolic for her. It was a way of leaving all of that violence at home and abuse. Okay. The other thing is the state of mind, and it's important to understand what was the state of mind prior to the suicide attempt. The need to communicate one's last moments of thinking also appear to be associated with the method. Bizarre methods or disorganized strategies are associated with psychosis or with disorganized, insecure attachments. So the CDC reports that firearms are the most commonly used method, then suffocation, and then poisoning. There's been a recent change in the methods, and there's been sort of an uptick in suffocation, especially for the younger adolescents. And I think that has to do with two things. Primarily, it has to do, again, with accessibility for the younger adolescents. And then it also has to do with engaging in risky sexual stimulation through oxygen deprivation. There are adolescents out there using that to be sexually stimulated, and they lose control. And so this is an example of high lethality, but low intention. They may not have meant to kill themselves, but this was very risky behavior. Firearms are used most often by older adolescents. So we need to, there are enormous research needs in this area. We need to study the roles of ethnicity and culture. As I mentioned before, we need to understand what are the risk and protective factors and what differences they make, how they come together. Multiple risk factors usually increase risk. Multiple protective factors tend to protect the adolescent from suicide completion. There's also the need to understand what stress of societal expectation does in terms of the pressure on adolescents. And of course, the stress of stigma. We need to understand the roles of racism. We need to understand the roles of discrimination, socioeconomic factors such as poverty and limited opportunities and access. That's going to be critical over the next couple of years, because we all know we're dealing with a very difficult socioeconomic situation that's not going to get better soon. So we need to be attuned to that when we meet with adolescents and their families. We also need to understand the effects of acculturation and the erosion of some of those protective, ethnic, specific social supports. It was hypothesized by one of the researchers that some of that is operating in the Latino community, where it has been some higher suicide attempts, where the acculturation is not synchronous, where parents and adolescents are acculturating at a very different rate, and there's distress and conflict about an adolescent not assuming traditional social roles in the way that the parent wants the adolescent to, and that creates a certain kind of family conflict. So we need to understand how that contributes as a risk factor. And we also need to understand the contributions in terms of protective factors on faith and spirituality. We also need to understand and how in some religious communities that strict religious guidelines can get incorporated into punitive, internalized punitive actions against the self. And I say this because there have been a number of adolescents that I've interviewed who were psychotic, who were hallucinating, and the commands from the hallucinations had to do with punishment for having sinned, and that they were doing God's work in taking action against themselves or against others. So when listening, we usually see faith and spirituality as a positive, and it usually is. But when you're dealing with someone who may have a psychotic process, you also want to listen and see how spiritual, religious, ethnic customs may be used in the service of a psychotic process. So you want to listen closely for that. Okay, so how do I think about this, or how do I think it would be helpful for you to think about this? From a biopsychosocial perspective, that is that you need to sort of broaden your lens when you work with adolescents and when you work with their families. You need to understand that you're working with a biological creature whose brain has not fully developed. We now know from brain research that the temporal lobe, that the frontal lobe, and that other brain areas have not finished developing. Especially, and there's the prefrontal cortex, which is, you know, if this is a head and inside here is your inner brain. So if you hold your hand up, the inside here is your inner brain, called the limbic system, and that's your emotional center, you know? And you close it up, and you've got your cerebrum here. Right here are your eyes. So behind your eyes is a very important connector from your emotions to your cognition. That area has not finished developing for adolescents, so they don't have the same ability to process emotionally and to use their reflective functioning. That's what they're learning. The other thing that you need to think about is that they're still in the process of pruning and wiring, so that they're laying down hardwiring, if you will, laying down neural pathways that they will use in their life still at 14 and 15. So if they're doing things like playing basketball, doing their studies, making friends, those neural pathways are getting laid down. If they're on the couch watching TV, if they're isolated in their room, if they're using a lot of drugs, if they're using a lot of alcohol, those things will affect their brain. We know that adolescent use of alcohol, adolescents respond much more to the use of alcohol, and there are some studies that have shown that it takes a much longer time for the effects of alcohol to wear off for an adolescent. So they're more physiologically, neurochemically vulnerable than adults. So we need to know about all of that. We need to know about their physiology. We need to know about stress systems and hormones. Adolescents are developing earlier now. The average age of menarche is 12. That's the average age. So one of the things you have going on is you have an adolescent girl who's pubescent. She started her period. There's been enormous hormonal and physiological development, but it's way ahead of her brain development. And so that's a special challenge to an adolescent girl, and she will need support, education, a kind of holding environment as she grows into her body. Then we need to understand what's going on socially in a macro system way. You need to know what the neighborhood is for the child. You need to understand their schools. You need to think about the larger social systems. We're working on systems of care, and that's a very important way that systems that respond to the needs of adolescents get integrated. And the other thing about we have the bio, we have the social, and the psycho. What makes us different from other biological creatures, from other mammals? We make meaning of things, right? And so we need to understand the psychological meaning of things for our adolescents. Without knowing that, we can't successfully help them in their therapy, in the work that you do with them. Because it can't just be crisis management, or you can all get stuck there. What really begins to guide, really begins to benefit the treatment is when the adolescent begins to make meaning of what happened, and when they can reflect back on it. As that adolescent in our Conrad was his name, as Conrad did in the video, he was beginning to reflect upon what had happened to him and make meaning about it. It wasn't something, it starts out there, and by the time he's finished talking to his friend, it's something that he feels that was within him as well. And in that way, he could have sort of a representational competence about the experience of attempting suicide. Okay, so the theoretical perspective is a biopsychosocial one. So if we're working with adolescents, we need to understand what are the developmental demands. What's this stage? It's an open-ended stage. Let me just say that. It doesn't come in locksteps. And when I say open-ended, I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that children grow at such different rates and in such different ways.